Hey, what's up, family, and welcome to another episode of the Church Systems Podcast. I am Henry Tolbert, and this podcast is your go to spot for making sure that you can begin to implement and input all of the systems that will help you build a healthy church and see healthy growth. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking to you about worship planning. That's right, worship planning. I know for some of us, worship planning seems like a really simple thing. It seems like a really easy thing to navigate. But the truth of the matter is that worship planning is a part of the lifeblood of any growing church. If you're going to have a church that's growing and continuing to reach more people, one of the things we've got to think about is our biggest opportunity to engage them, which for most churches is the weekend worship service. And so today we're going to be talking about the what's and the whys behind the weekend worship service to make sure that you can take the right next steps and that you can be on top of what God might be trying to do in your church. All right. For those of you who haven't met me, I'm the owner and founder of Simple Systems Consulting. We are a consulting firm that really focuses on helping churches implement the systems to see healthy growth. And when we talk about growth, we're talking about spiritual growth. The people are being developed. We're talking about numerical growth. The church is expanding in its reach, and financial growth is that we are having the resources to help more people develop more people and do more of the work that God has called us to do. All right. So let's jump straight into this episode. All right. So when we talk about worship planning, one of the first things that I think is so important for us to think about is to really describe what we mean when we talk about worship planning. What I'm saying is that when we talk about worship planning, what we're realizing and what we're recognizing is that what happens on the weekend does not have to be random. It doesn't just have to be a random collection of moments. It doesn't have to be, let's just show up and let's see what happens. But instead, we can begin to plan. The way I used to talk about this as a church planter with our team is I would say to them, hey, look, let's fill the pots with water. Let's make sure that we fill the pots. And this was a reference to Jesus' first miracle at the wedding of Cana, is that Jesus turned the water into wine, but they had to have the pots and they had to do the work of filling them with water. And then he put his miracle on the things that they already had in place. And so I would say to our teams on Sunday, I would say, hey, look, let's make sure that we fill the pots, that we've got the pots ready. Let's make sure we're organized, that we've got what we need. And then let's trust God for what he wants to do with everything else. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about worship planning. I'm not talking about this stiff approach to church that says we have to control everything. But what I'm saying is let's be organized and in unity and on the same page about what we're doing on the weekend. And then let's give God a blueprint. Let's give him our natural and trust him to pour his super on top of it. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about worship planning is we're talking about avoiding all of the things that become a distraction to what God may be wanting to do, right? We're talking about avoiding the things of videos not working, audio and sound issues, ministry areas not being staffed. We're talking about all those things that we can get ahead of to make sure that we're on the same page so that when Sunday comes, we can allow God to breathe on our excellence. I say this all the time, but excellence is invisible. Is that when we do things the right way, when we do things with excellence that is worthy of our holy God, one of the things that we see is that things just seem to flow in the way that they're supposed to flow. And we open ourselves up for what I like to call miracle moments. And so today, I hope I can help you in this episode really begin to move forward. All right. So a couple of things I want you to think about. Number one, very, very simple. I want you to think about an agenda. Do you have an agenda for the weekend, right? And I don't mean some kind of secret agenda about what you hope will happen, but do you have an actual agenda on paper so that all of the people involved in the weekend know exactly what's happening, right? Especially if you're a senior leader. When you hit the stage on Sunday, you should already know what songs are the worship team going to be singing. You should already know who are the volunteers who are going to be leading certain areas. You should already know, is there a team that's been struck with so much, sickness and illness has popped up that we're not going to have that ministry today? You should know. You need to know whether or not children's church is operating on Sunday. You need to know whether or not we've got these different things going on based on what has happened and how we have planned the agenda throughout the week. And so, one The simple reasons that I think so many churches struggle with the execution of their weekend strategy is they don't have an agenda. And I need you to get this. Not only do you need an agenda, but you need to make sure that everybody involved in the weekend service has that agenda at least 3 days before the weekend. I would like to say on Wednesday, at least a draft of the agenda needs to be in the hands of all the volunteers. Another mistake that I see so often is that the agenda is often stuck in the hands of the leaders or the staff of a church, and it never gets to the volunteers. And it's the volunteers who make it go. It's the volunteers who execute. And so when you put together an agenda, you need to make sure it's getting in the hands of the right people. All right. And so one simple thing that I want you to think about is, what is your agenda? What is the agenda for this weekend? What are we getting done? What are the important parts that people need to know? I tell you, it can be disheartening for your volunteers when they show up to church on Sunday only to realize that what is expected of them is different than what has been communicated in the past. And so, one of the ways that you can even work on retaining more volunteers is simply by communicating that we have a plan, that we have an agenda, that everything we're doing is not just these random pieces put together, but we've got a plan to it. So, you want to have an agenda. The next thing I want you to think about is, who are the teams for the weekend? You need to know every weekend, what are the teams operating and who are the people leading those teams. As you really get to know the teams that you have available and the teams that are operating, it will help you see how you need to communicate. Not only that, but you'll learn that when you want to execute an excellent service, it's not going to be just about the agenda, but it's about the people who will execute the agenda. So, what are the teams you're investing in for the weekend? You need to be thinking about that. In our blueprint, within our church systems boot camp, we encourage our churches to focus on three teams. That there are three teams that they really need to be thinking about and focusing on if they want to move towards healthy growth. What are those teams for you? What are the teams that you are going to focus on to make sure you're cultivating them, you're keeping them in the loop, and to make sure that you're investing in the future of where everything is going? You've got to understand that it takes people to do ministry. And the better you become at building and managing and leading teams, the more equipped your church will be to go into the future. And so you've got to be making sure that you're constantly communicating with your teams, with the leaders of your teams, so that they can see things, so that you can see things begin to move forward and go in the right direction. So, what are your teams? When you start to think in terms of teams, you'll learn that as a leader, you have to be more organized, because a small change for you becomes a big change once it goes into all your teams. For example, I never forget children's leader coming to me one day and saying, "Hey, when service goes beyond a certain point, here's what that means for us. We've exhausted our agenda, and so we start to get, unruly, cranky kids who are going this. All right. And so we had a conversation and we made it very clear they didn't expect me to say no to the Holy Spirit because they had cranky kids, but they wanted me to be aware. They wanted our staff to be aware that what happens in service affects them as well. And so if we have a Sunday that we believe could be a longer Sunday, or if we're adding different elements, they want to know so that they then can adjust. All right. Even your volunteers who are out of service, like your children's ministry and people in the parking lot, whatever it is, what's your provision for them on Sundays when you have communion? Right? They may want to do communion with their families like everybody else, but we've got to have a plan. And so that comes from thinking in terms of teams. All right. So that's what I want you to think about. Who are your teams? All right. Here's another thing when it comes to worship planning, very simple, but very important. What are we singing? I think it's important that we sync up the music that we sing with the message that we preach. And not only do we need to sync it with the message, but we need to sync it with the people we're trying to reach. So, what we're singing on the weekend should match the message we preach and the people we want to reach. Here's what I mean. If you're going to be preaching thematically, if you're preaching on a specific thing, it is helpful for that theme to start at the beginning of service. And for most of us, the beginning of our service is worship. It is the music, it is the singing, it is the engaging. And so, what you want to do is that you want to make sure as a leader, you're letting your teams know the topic you're preaching on or the theme you're preaching on so that they can then match the worship with what you're preaching. So now you have unity, you have synergy, you have everybody on the same page about what's coming and about where you're headed and where the worship music is getting ready to go. But another thing you need to think about with music is, does it match both the people you have and the people you want to reach? Here's the hard truth is that most people are musical, especially in the African American culture. We're a musical people, which means music is a very, very high value. And so, what we've learned is that it seems like every generation kind of has its own sound, right? Every generation has a sound that it likes to lean into. Well, you've got to ask yourself, if you're trying to reach a specific group of people, is their sound represented in the music that you sing? And I want to be clear about this. I believe that God, He supersedes every genre. And so, as such, He can be found in every genre of music. And so, no one generation has a monopoly on the glory and the presence of God. God can come in on whatever. I've seen Him come in on a cappella. I've seen Him come in off key singing. I've seen Him come in everything. But what I'm asking you to think about is, how are you intentionally reaching into the groups that you're praying God to send? And it's not about catering to their preferences, but it's about connecting to their experiences. It's about connecting to how they hear music and how they listen to music and where they are. And I try to remind every generation of this, is that every single generation, the music that they listened to was crazy and was outlandish in many cases to the generation before them. I remember watching this movie on Ray Charles, and how when he began to sing this music, people saw it as sacrilegious and they saw it as the most horrible thing ever. And now when you look back at it, it's so tame compared to what we do today. But that's often how change happens. Change often startles those who are living in it, but it becomes normal to those who are raised in it. And so, one of the things that you've got to be thinking about is, how are you reaching back into people when it comes to your music? All right. So, that's what are we singing? But here's another thing, is I want you to think about, how are we engaging people? How are you going to engage people? When you think about your worship service, you don't want people to come into the building and to go through an entire experience with you and to just sit there and just look at you crazy. As somebody who's been preaching for a number of years, I can tell you, I don't like when it feels like I'm pulling teeth to get people engaged, right? I want people to be engaged and involved. But here's the thing, we've got to teach them how to be engaged. I've always been big on helping my worship leader begin to see the different ways that we go beyond just singing a song, but teaching people, training them on what it means to engage and be involved in worship. And we don't want them involved just because of, we need a response as leaders. It's not about me, but I'm teaching them a practice that they can take home with them. I want to teach them to engage in worship. So I want you to think about, how can we engage people in our worship service? So a part of that is, number one, worship, right? Are you teaching people what it means? Having moments where you say, hey, come on, lift your hands with me right here, right? Just that statement gives people permission. Come on, let's clap together. Come on, let's clap just like this, right? Or having these moments where you do congregational singing, where you'll sing a song and say, hey, look, all the music stop, all the singers stop. Let's hear the congregation sing. To me, those are some of the most powerful moments I've ever seen in worship. It's those moments where the worship leader points the microphone towards the people and says to them, now it's your turn to sing. We've led you, but now it's your turn. We've taught you the song, but now it's your turn to sing. Another part of engaging people, especially if you're a church with 100 people or less, one of the advantages that you have is that you can touch people. And so I encourage you to consider altar moments. Consider moments at the end of service where you ask people to respond and you say, hey, if I can pray with you about what I just preached, I want you to come to the altar. We want to pray with you. And just have a prayer team there ready to pray with people and touch them and hold them and grab their hands and put your hand on their shoulders and lay hands on them, all those different things. Those are moments that become movements. Those are moments that really engage people so that they can really be impacted by the experience that they have with the church in person. So I want you to be thinking about how can you as a church engage people and really take a step with them that lets them feel that they have been amongst the people of God. Not that they came and listened to singing or listened to a sermon, but that they got a chance to engage, that they got a chance to be a part of worship and take the next step. All right. Here's one final thing that I want you to think about when it comes to worship planning is how can you leverage technology? Here's the thing. I learned this years ago that when people hear something, they remember it a little bit. When they hear it and then they write it, they remember it even more. But when they hear it and they see it, their retention goes through the roof. And so, what you want to practice is using technology to let people hear you, let them see what you're saying, but also let them rehearse it. And so leverage technology with things like your PowerPoint presentation or a slide deck that goes along with your sermons. To make sure that as you're speaking, you put it up on screen, put it on a TV screen, projector, whatever it is you have. But you want to leverage that because it's going to help people retain what you're saying and what you're talking about. And so leverage technology that way. And here's another benefit. When you build a slide deck for your sermon, yes, it takes more work, it takes a little bit more effort. But now you've automatically got some things that you can post on social media throughout the week. You could take your slide deck and just post it as posts throughout the week, right? You've already taken a step to create new and more resources. But you've got to be thinking about how can you leverage technology? How can you turn your sermon into and your worship service into clips for Sunday? How can you do those things and make it happen? That's one of the things that we really coach our pastors through in our church systems boot camp is that we want to help them get more out of the sermon. Why spend 20, 30 hours a week building a sermon and then in thirty minutes you preach it and it's gone to never be used again? You can repurpose that same content to continue to get the gospel message out, even beyond the church and out to the world. Listen, I want you to know this that worship planning can be of such great and amazing value. But here's what you got to get. If you build a solid process, you can have predictable success. You've got to build a process for your weekend. Don't just expect it to go well, but instead build it in such a way that you can help it take the next steps, that you can make it easy for people to plug in and be a part of what God is doing through the church. All right. Listen, I hope this was a blessing to you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Church Systems Podcast. We'll be back here next week, same time. We look forward to continuing to help you move the needle so that you can get where God has called you to go. If you want to know more about who we are and what we do, you can learn more at getchurchsystems.com. You can go there, see who I am, see who we are, see how we serve churches just like you and how we can help you make a difference. All right. Until next time, keep the gears turning.